Hey everyone, my name is Kyle Gillen. I am the creator and developer of the Streamable Assets Manager, better known as S.A.M. Today we're going to be taking a look at the new automation system which will be coming to S.A.M in its next update, probably update 2.0.0. If you're watching this video, hopefully you already know a little bit about S.A.M, but if not, I'm going to encourage you to watch some of our other videos, especially the general overview video. So the new automation system is an addition to the World Designer tool, and its purpose is to allow developers to execute a set of actions or logic repeatedly for different assets in their game world in a very intuitive way. One of the main use cases of the automation feature will be the built-in light baking implementation, which is also coming in the next update. This new functionality is going to make it much easier to manage everything to do with light baking. And to be completely honest, I think it's a game changer. But we're going to explore that in a separate video and you can be the judge when you watch it. In addition to light baking and some other built-in automated actions, the automation system will also allow you as the developer to code your own actions and logic that can be executed on your game's assets. This can be used for something as simple as changing a single setting on multiple game objects, for executing some actions required by a third-party tool, or even for creating completely procedural worlds inside of the editor. All right, so let's get started. We need to launch the World Designer tool, which I have open here. For existing S.A.M users, you're going to notice that this tool is blank for you, and that's because currently it's only possible to launch the World Designer tool from the World Designer tab in the World Component Inspector. Fortunately, I'm changing this so that you can launch the tool directly from the window. And it's a small change, but I think it will definitely improve the workflow experience. So let's go ahead and do that now. And hopefully you're already familiar with the tool and you know that you can easily load in assets by selecting cells, hitting the L button, and then you can edit them however you want. You can save them and you can unload them. You can let the autosave functionality work its magic. You know, whatever you need to do, you can do. You can also set up different combinations of cells across world groupings to be loaded together by creating world regions for those cells, which we've already done here. So we can click the simple button and it loads a bunch of different cells across different world groupings. So here we have vegetation. We have some smaller assets, and yeah, it's pretty cool. And all this existing functionality is great because it allows you to edit individual asset chunks and different regions of the world in a very intuitive manner. But there's just some stuff that's a lot easier to do with an automated workflow. Now, at its core, the automation system simply makes use of the existing functionality that we've just gone over, the loading of cells, the saving of cells, and the unloading of cells. Basically, how it works, and we'll just start by unloading everything, is you either select some cells, and these are the primary cells, which I'll explain in a bit, or you can have it execute the automated actions for every single cell in the streamable grid. And you click this button that says execute automate operation. I hit proceed and you can see. So what it's doing is basically collecting a bunch of cells, loading them, optionally saving them, loading them, executing an action, optionally saving those cells, then executing the next action, saving them if you want, executing the next action, and so on. And you can see that for each grouping you can set up your actions, your automated actions, as many as you want. You can have one, which is probably the most common case, or you can have 10. You know, it really doesn't matter. And it's actually the automated actions themselves which are going to control whether the cells are saved after each action is executed. So once all the actions are executed for a group of cells, those cells are unloaded, and then the next group of cells are loaded and actions are run again, and so on and so on. The automated actions are simply scriptable assets, so you can just derive from the automated action abstract class in order to create your own actions. The crux of this automated action class is the execute action method. This method is going to take in some input data, primarily the loaded world cells, and then it's going to do its work. And then finally, you're going to output some information like whether the operation completed successfully and also whether the cells need to be saved by the World Designer tool. So you may be wondering at this point, how does the tool actually choose what other cells are loaded alongside the primary cell? So when you execute an automated operation, you do for a set of primary cells on a particular grouping. In this case, we're working with grouping 1, which is the light probes grouping. For each input primary cell, which can be cells selected in this window, or it can be every cell on this grouping streamable grid by enabling the automated every cell option. And for each input primary cell, the sampling method defines how the cells which are loaded alongside the primary cell are chosen. It should also be noted that you can completely disable all cells for a particular grouping to be loaded using these toggles at the bottom of the automated settings window. And these settings are actually unique per world grouping. So if I go ahead and navigate to my grouping, let's say 3, and I change some of the settings. So you disable those ones. And now if I go back to my grouping 1, you can see that those settings there have not changed because the settings are unique. So getting back to the sampling method, the first method we're going to talk about is cell ownership. With cell ownership, the additional cells that are loaded alongside the primary cell are the cells from each grouping which are owned by the primary cell. Now when we talk about ownership, what we're really talking about is cells whose has a position that falls within the primary cell. Currently, the position that we use is the cell position, which is defined as the minimum point of the cell. However, we could change this based on feedback to the asset chunk position or to the position of the middle of the cell. Looking at this drawing, you can see that I have 4 cells from a grouping that are overlapping the primary cell, which is the black cell. So even though we have 4 cells overlapping the primary cell, the position of the top right cell is the only one whose position falls within the actual bounds of the cell. So that is the only cell that is actually owned by that primary cell. And so it's the only cell from this grouping that will be loaded alongside the primary cell. All right, so going back to our World Designer tool, we can see the other sampling method, which is active grid query. This is a more advanced sampling method, and it gives a better approximation of what the layout of cells would be at runtime. And basically what it does is for each input primary cell, it finds all the cells from a particular grouping that overlap that primary cell. So in this case, it doesn't matter whether the cell is owned by the primary cell. All that matters is that it overlaps the primary cell. It then takes all of these overlapping cells and passes them to the active grid. And basically what it's saying is, active grid, here's the cells that the player might be in. Give me the cells that should be loaded whenever the player is in those cells. It then takes all of those cells returned by the active grid and combines them together, and then splits them into 2 separate groups, secondary cells and tertiary cells. So the distinction between secondary cells and tertiary cells is very, very simple, but also very important. Basically, secondary cells are cells which are owned by the primary cell, which, if you've been following along, you should know means that those cell positions fall within the bounds of the primary cell. Tertiary cells, on the other hand, are cells whose position fall outside of the bounds of the primary cell. All right, so let's look at this by actually loading in some cells and asset chunks, and I think it will be a little bit more obvious what is a secondary cell and what is a tertiary cell. So I'm going to load in my terrain, and then I'm going to go to my global settings tab and load in a world region that I've already configured, and it's going to be primary cell 44. So this world region just contains all the cells that would have been loaded if I were to perform an automate operation using that primary cell 44 from the base grouping. We've got all of our assets now that are associated with those cells loaded in, and we can see that we've got some buildings and some other stuff, some vegetation. And if we navigate to our grouping 3, which is our large structures, which is basically the buildings and the houses and such, we can see that we've got 7 cells loaded in. And each of those cells, of course, can have 1 or more assets associated with them, not just necessarily a single asset. So this cell here for 4, because these cells in this grouping match the size of the cells from the base grouping exactly, all the cells line up perfectly. In this case, that means that this cell for 4 falls within the bounds of the primary cell from the base grouping, and thus it would be a secondary cell if this load operation had occurred with an automate operation. Looking at a different grouping, we can see the same thing here. These 4 cells that fall within the bounds of the primary cell would be loaded in as secondary cells, and then all the cells that surround it, whose positions do not fall within the bounds of the primary cell, would be loaded in as tertiary cells. So to understand why this distinction between secondary and tertiary cells is so important, let's go ahead and load in a new world region that I've configured to represent the cells that would be loaded for an automated operation involving primary cell 4-5. So when I do this, I get some new asset chunks loaded in, but I also get some asset chunks that were previously loaded for primary cell 4-4. For example, if we go back to our grouping 3, we can see that we've got cell 4-4 loaded again. So imagine that we had performed some kind of modifications or baked some data for the asset chunks of this cell when it was loaded for primary cell 4-4. Now that it's loaded for cell 4-5, if we perform some additional modifications or bake some data, we'll most likely end up overwriting the data or the modifications that we just made. However, by designating this cell as a tertiary cell in this instance, it's a way to tell the automated actions that you can go ahead and use these tertiary cells for whatever you want, along with their asset chunks, but don't write data to them, don't write data for them, don't make modifications to them, because if you do, they're most likely those modifications are going to be discarded at a later date and be overwritten. On the other hand, because secondary cells are guaranteed to only be loaded once as secondary cells for an entire set of primary cells, we can pretty much guarantee that any data you write to them or for them or any modifications you make will basically stick. They will not be overwritten at a later date. At this point, you may be wondering, if we're not making any modifications to these tertiary cells and their asset chunks or baking data for them, then why are we even loading them? To understand that, let's think about light baking. So, as an example here, we're just going to unload the tertiary cells surrounding the cell 4-5. And when we do this, you'll notice that all of the lighting in the scene completely changes, the shadows change, everything changes. And if we were going to bake our lighting data at this point, it would be completely wrong, right? So even though we are baking only the lighting data for this cell 4-5, in order to get the shadows right and the indirect lighting right, we actually need to load all those cells surrounding it. By loading those cells as tertiary cells, we're able to allow them to contribute global illumination without overriding any baked lighting data they might already have. Let's talk a little bit about the adjust origin cell setting. So when you have this setting enabled, for every primary cell that's processed, the World Designer tool is going to search for the base grouping cell that owns that primary cell, and then it's going to set the World Designer tool's origin cell to that cell before processing and before loading cells for that primary cell. When you disable the option, whatever origin cell you already have configured will remain the origin cell for every single primary cell that's processed for that specific automate operation. So for example, here we've got our origin cell set to 4-4, and with adjust origin cell disabled, this is going to be the origin cell that's used for every single group of cells that's loaded for the given automate operation. So we can see this in action by selecting 2 cells that are far away from each other and executing an automate operation with the setting enabled and disabled. First, we'll disable it and execute. And in this instance, you're going to notice that the asset chunks are loaded in at different locations because that origin cell is remaining fixed. However, if we enable the setting and execute the same exact operation again for the same cells, you're going to see that those asset chunks are actually being loaded in around the same area, which is the origin position set on your world component. The final thing I want to bring to your attention is the fact that up until this point, we've been using these cells from the base grouping as the primary cells. However, there's nothing stopping you from using cells from any grouping as the primary cells. In fact, that's why we have unique settings for each of these groupings, because in general, different groupings require different things. They require different automated actions. They require different secondary and tertiary cell groupings to be loaded. When you use a non-base grouping cell as the primary cell, the tool is going to find out which base grouping cell owns that cell from the other grouping, and it's going to set the origin cell to that cell when you have the adjust origin cell setting enabled. And that's it. If you've made it through this entire video, I appreciate your dedication, and I hope everyone's as excited as I am for this new automate operation and the new light baking stuff and whatever else is added that can be supported by this new automate functionality.